Wherever English travelled around the globe, the story was the same. New colonies developed dialects of their own, even when no other foreign languages were involved. In January 1788, a fleet of 11 ships, commanded by Captain Arthur Phillip, sailed gingerly between these headlands, after 8 months at sea, to make landfall in the country which would become Australia. The place they chose to settle would become Sydney Harbour. Today, the ferries which transport Sydney's commuters bear the names of the ships of what was known as the First Fleet: Sirius, Supply, Fishbourne, Friendship, Borrowdale. Their original cargo was also human. Over 700 seasick, half-starved souls, feared, despised and rejected by their British homeland, the ancestors of some of these commuters, the first convicts.
Let us drink a good health to our schemers above, who at length have contrived from this land to remove thieves.
Over the next 80 years, over 150,000 convicts were transported to Australia.
At Botany Bay, the hulks and the jails had some thousands in store, but out of the jails are 10,000 times more who live by fraud, cheating, vile tricks
The British saw this as unsettled land, but of course it was peopled by native Australians. The Aboriginal tribes had over 250 languages. Many would disappear over time. But in the early days, the settlers were fascinated by the natives, and from them they learned the names for many of the new plants and animals they were encountering, like the kangaroo. English picked up more words from the native languages around Sydney Harbour: boomerang, dingo, koala, wallaby, wallaroo and wombat. And cooey, which was a call used by natives to summon one another from a distance, was soon adopted by the English. And there's also a type of owl called the boobuk, a tree called the warata, which has become the emblem of New South Wales, warrigal, which is another name for the dingo, and woomera, a throwing stick. As settlement spread, English picked up words from other native languages: billabong, a cut-off pool in the branch of a river; budgerigar, yabby, which is a crustacean; barramundi, a giant perch; and from Western Australia, kylie, another word for boomerang. When Australian English developed its own character, which it quickly did, it came less from the relatively few borrowings from the native languages. Overwhelmingly, it was shaped by the regional and criminal background of the early settlers. Some words that we think are most typically Australian were actually imported. Dialect words that have died out in England but hung on in their new home. Cobber comes from the verb cob, meaning to take a liking to. Dinkum was a word for work, and fair dinkum meant something similar to fair play. And digger was another word that sailed halfway around the world, English then, Australian now. The new Australians got their most colourful vocabulary from the criminal slang of 18th century London, which was known as flash or kiddie talk. Kiddie from the verb to kid, as in to cheat or to fool. Some of the words they used are familiar to us now. Chum, meaning a fellow prisoner. Swag was a bundle of loot. Job for robbery, Judy for woman, mug for face, pigs for police, beak for magistrate, lark for prank, split for betray by informing, put up job and stow it, meaning keeping quiet, are all found in Australia and in the criminal language of Dickens' Oliver Twist. It didn't take long for tension to develop between the prisoners and their descendants and the other British immigrants who'd come to make a new life in Australia and were forming the colonial establishment. People like the MacArthurs, who settled here at Elizabeth Farm near Sydney and invented the Australian sheep industry. These British incomers were known as sterling, and they spoke the language of the home country. The people born in Australia were known as currency and spoke the local dialect. At Elizabeth Farm, male convicts were assigned to labour in the surrounding fields, females to work as servants in the house and kitchens. Social divisions continued, defined by language. But over time, convicts who'd served their sentences could become citizens of the emerging country and call themselves government men, legitimates, exiles, or empire builders. By the 1880s, immigrants were outnumbered by native-born Australians, and Australian English was in rude good health. The weekly bulletin started appearing in Sydney. Known as the Bushman's Bible, it was sensational, outspoken and slangy. In its pages you find words like fair dinkum, larrikin, bonza, bloody, offsider, fair cow, battler and bludger, classic Australian. And there are examples of vivid Australian phrase-making. Better than a poke in the eye with a burnt stick, or as miserable as a bandicoot on a burnt ridge. And there are also poems and songs which help create the image of the Australian bushman and his speech in the outback.
Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Waltzing Matilda. Matilda is slang for a bedroll. Waltzing Matilda means going on the road. Was written on a sheep station by the poet and solicitor Banjo Patterson in 1895.
And waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing.
With its mix of words from English convict slang like swagman, meaning a drifter, and from Aboriginal languages like billabong for pond and coolabah for eucalyptus, Waltzing Matilda encapsulates the essence of Australian English at the time. And in the figure of the swagman, who'd rather die than be taken prisoner, it captures an attitude, a contempt for authority, which would become a national trait.
You'll never take me alive, said he, and his ghost may be heard as you pass by that billabong. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda.
But while the Australian vocabulary grew and Australian phrases were coined, Australian English didn't get official respectability. In 1926, the Director of Education in New South Wales could still write,
"It is sad to reflect that other people are able to recognise Australians by their speech. Most unfortunately, a variation from the accepted standard is along lines which are harsh, unmusical and unpleasant to the ear. Teachers must do their utmost to check this development away from standard English."
All nations have their symbols, and Australia is well served by Sydney Harbour, this day fit for a queen, their queen. As for New Zealand...
The English language had sent its slang and its dialects to a new country where they developed a personality of their own. But standard English was keeping them in thrall. The ways of speaking in Australia formed a rigid social hierarchy. The broad vowels and slang were at the bottom. Standard English, Queen's English, was at the top. The convicts might have thrown off their physical shackles, but the local language wouldn't lose its chains until the late 20th century. Just as in the Caribbean, English was still keeping its children down.
But all Australia was eager for a sight of this young woman. Here too, it was the first time that the reigning sovereign had landed on Australia's shores.